Hello, folks. Thank you for listening to another one of my efforts to educate Vermonters, because it's really important that we all have correct facts before we can make judgments. And it's particularly true with regard to our police and being called systemically racist in this state. It's long overdue, since we were all involved in this conversation. I have an article out today I'd like to summarize for you. I'm going to pretty much read a lot of it because I'm reading from the resources that you need to know about. Because for years now, the liberal media have been calling Vermont's police and Vermonters in general racists, systemically racist. The whole system is just stacked against black people. Like, Vermonters are baffled by this because we know better. Not that we don't have racism, but you notice the liberal media loves to find somebody with a Confederate flag to paint all of us with. I still say I've never seen a Nazi flag in this state in my life. And I've been coming here and living here for a long time. So what they've been doing, though, is they've been using flawed statistics, and increasingly it really looks deliberate. We really have to ask as Vermonters whether this is deliberate, because a UVM professor by the name of Stephanie Seguino, that's another writer, issued a study back in 2017 where she measured police bias by comparing traffic stops of black and Hispanic drivers to the Vermont general population, without regard to where they were from. So what she's really doing with this supposedly revelatory research that showed the whole nation what a spike in Vermont incarceration of blacks all of a sudden showed how racist we'd become in the late 2000 and teens. Well, actually, there's an opioid epidemic going on, and I'm a recovery coach, and I deal with it, and I was a criminal defense attorney, and these were my clients. Now, there's nothing racist about identifying the demographic origin of people transporting drugs. They come from a different demographic than Vermont. So I'm not saying that only black people bring drugs into the state, but proportionately, given the larger minority population. At one time, when I lived in Hartford, Connecticut, it was about 80% black and Hispanic, and the gangs were almost 100% black and Hispanic. The white gangs were kind of pretty lame punks, frankly. But what she's done is undermine police efforts by calling them racists for doing their job, potentially, because we don't really know. So what she does is she uses an out-of-state numerator of blacks over an in-state denominator of Vermont blacks, which in Vermont is about 1.4% of our population. So the left then has been jumping all over this amongst other studies, but this one's the big one, to say that Vermont has a higher incarceration rate of blacks than its underlying population, which is true, and thus is systemically racist, which is not true. It's actually absurd. It's a fundamental rule of statistics that causation or connection does not prove causation. So when Vermont police arrest black or Hispanic out-of-state fentanyl dealers, of course, the incarceration rate of blacks will increase relative to black Vermonters. That is drug interdiction. That's not racism. That's they're doing their job. And I'm not saying there aren't any racist police, but you need evidence of that rather than to impute it by a manipulation of statistics, which this is. The BIPOC percentage in Hartford and Springfield is higher. You don't use that as a numerator over Vermont's denominator unless you really want to malign us and make us and our police look bad. Seguino's study ignores origin, focusing on stop rates by race compared to racial shares of the population. This is shoddy research that's been leveraged by the liberal media, who do not want to look at the real numbers, and I can prove that because for years I've been trying to ask them to. And there are lots of studies that have shown Professor Seguino is not doing this, and yet she came out with a new study last week through 2019 telling us how racist we are, using the same stupid, deliberately obnoxious errancy. We pay you to betray us. We pay police officers to protect us, and we're paying an academic who's out of touch with reality to put us all at risk and put our children potentially at risk of drug deaths. Why? Because she has an ideological bent. Thomas Sowell talks about this in the book I mentioned last time, Discrimination and Disparities. A really good read that they don't want you to read, because you'll see what they're up to. They being those who are American progressives. So they started the eugenics movement. This was American progressivism. The eugenics movement really also, Hitler was based on a genetic determinism. I mean, if you came from bad genes, you were never going to amount to anything, so we need to help you out. Marx and the Stalinists then advocated economic determinism. Everything was about class. That's the one issue. It defines everything, and it's a lie. And people suffered horribly. Today's progressives embrace an equally dogmatic racial or race determinism, which Sowell calls a seemingly invincible fallacy. It's not invincible because it's a fallacy. And he also calls it a non sequitur underlying the prevailing social vision of our time. It's not vision, it's darkness. Professor Seguino's work is just such a non sequitur as he's talking about. Sowell specifically condemns such disparate impact statistics as ideologically motivated by a political crusade, quote unquote, to create a presumption of discrimination. This is what Sowell says. Stampede, and by the way, he's talking about in that manipulating legitimate statistics. He's not even talking about manipulating the statistics like here so they're not even reliable or actually worth printing any paper on and killing trees. You're destroying the environment, Professor, with really dumb stuff. So I'm going to send a copy of this to Vermont UVM President Suresh Garamella and let him know what he has on his hands, because this really disgraces our university and our state. If true, and it looks like it's true, what Thomas Sowell says is stampedes toward one-factor explanations do not exempt even the leading intellectuals of an era like Seguino from a default setting in many social theories that regard the absence of equality in outcomes as automatic signs of some sinister influences which have prevented this natural equality from taking place. As he points out, it does not exist, never has, never will. You try to have equality of outcomes, you will create inequalities of opportunity. Just look at South Africa right now. The historic consequences of treating particular beliefs as sacred dogmas beyond the reach of evidence or logic should be enough to dissuade us from going down that road again, despite how exciting or emotionally satisfying political dogmas and the crusades resulting from those can be, or how easy to avoid thinking about it. You know, Stephanie Seguino attended the rally that our people held to support the police to help BLM shut it down. This is a paid academic who's blatantly biased, showing up at a toxic stifling of people's free speech rights to defend their police or speak up against her lies. You need to find another place to stay, another state to live in, because you've abused your Vermont privilege, not white privilege, the privilege to live amongst Vermonters and defame them and degrade them and lie about them. We're getting sick of that. And Phil Scott can answer for this too, because he's been piling right on this wagon, haven't you? Well, Governor, we'd like to know how we're systemic racist now that the only statistics you have been shown to be fraudulent. A 2020 study by the Justice Center concluded, quote, black people who are identified as residents of other states make up a small number, but a larger proportion of non-residents within Vermont corrections populations. And on page 31, it shows that 19% of drug offenders were black out-of-staters versus 5% white. Vermont has seen a 33% plus increase in opioid deaths in the last year, as I report in another article at True North Reports. Could that be that police are afraid to pull people over because they'll be called racist? Could it be that the gangs are being helped by Professor Seguino? Because it could be. I'm only saying it could be. I'd like to know the truth because they're hiding it. Vermont Public Radio noted the absence of these out-of-state statistics in 2018. They were interviewing someone named, last name Joy, I think. Her next study is looking at something we mentioned earlier, the question of how many African-American inmates are residents of Vermont versus from out of state. And they also mentioned the VPR interview. And according to that new report from the Department of Corrections, just 1.6% of Vermont's prison population in 2017 were black people from out of state. Well, if that's true, Vermont is only 1.4% black. So if we have 1.6% of our inmates are from out of state, then we're already at over 114% of our in-state population, and we haven't added them in yet. So yeah, we look terrible, but we're not. Are people guilty or not? And are they being judged as guilty or not, regardless of race? And if you're against the drug war because you say that's racist, okay, fine. I can embrace legalization of heroin, I suppose, and I'd rather see legalization of heroin than Vermont wrongly called racist, because it's not worth the price. A 2019 study, though, that I just got hold of, assessed the conduct of the Bennington, Vermont Police Department in a lawsuit, and it noted, specifically looked at Seguino's work. These are other There's another statistical analysis. Funny, we don't hear about this in the media, Vermont Digger and VPR. Quote, Seguino's study was seriously flawed and its conclusions do not stand up to academic rigor. First, the data used included multiple tickets and warnings for events. This means that if a driver received a warning and a ticket at one stop, the study counted it as two separate stops. And if a search was conducted, two separate searches. In the data provided for our study, we find that in 1,000 of the 3,235 stops, the drivers had residences out of state. An additional 246 drivers had residences in Vermont, but outside of Bennington County. This means that 1/3 of the drivers stopped had no relationship to the demographics of Bennington County. At that rate, 1/3 of our inmates would be black to match that structure right there, wouldn't it? If they were guilty. I mean, that would really make us look really racist in Bennington, wouldn't it? And Bennington and Brattleboro are being flooded in the south end of Vermont with what? I know, I talk to people. I also know of people collecting welfare in both Massachusetts and Vermont. I don't think we support welfare fraud. It's not fair to people who need welfare. But the opioid crisis explains Vermont's spike in black incarcerations. I mean, heaven forbid that would all make sense. I mean, we must be racist to look at facts, right? I'm a criminal defense attorney. I don't care what color you are. This is not me being a racist. It has nothing to do with it. I just want to know the truth. I want to know what the facts are rather than have an ideological dogma be shoved down our throats and subjugate us and turn us into like Eskimos or Indians that you treat like dirt while you denigrate us in our culture. I love my culture. I'm proud of my culture. It doesn't make me a racist. I like to get maple syrup out of trees. So do the Abenakis. It's our culture. So once again, she comes out with a recent updated report, and it again avoids state of origin data. She also did another report, it's on her website, about the Bennington police, omits out-of-state residency. Is this total incompetence or is this deliberate? Professor Seguino, please tell us. Governor Scott, UVM, tell us, do you condone this? But in that study, she concedes that, quote, given the low percentages of people of color in Vermont, even a small amount of missing race data can distort results. Is she trying to cover her butt when the real truth comes out? Because we see from VPR and what I'm showing you here that others have complained, and there's the Bennington report, and still, you don't include those statistics even though you acknowledge how tremendously biased it would be potentially to use to mismatch statistics. And she gets paid as a public servant while she stomps around with BLM thugs. This is what Thomas Sowell warned us about. They manipulate the statistics to shame and degrade us for power, political power. He says this, 2 of the monumental catastrophes of the 20th century, Nazism and communism, led to the slaughter of millions of human beings by their own governments in the name of either ridding the world of the burden of inferior races or ridding the world of exploiters responsible for the poverty of the exploited. While each of these beliefs might have been testable hypotheses, their greatest political triumphs came as dogmas placed beyond the reach of evidence or logic. Discrimination as an explanation of economic and social disparities may have a similar emotional appeal for many. And it is an emotional appeal, and maybe then they believe it, and I'm sad that they do when it's not true, and they're being told to be afraid of and hate fellow citizens who are not guilty of what we're being charged of, especially our police. In Vermont, this emotional appeal of hate is clouding common sense and evidentiary analysis, dangerously undermining our police, opening a wide gate to drug trafficking, and threatening public safety. Reality defeats dogma every time, even in Vermont. And the reality is that our police probably have been doing our job. Can we just get the real numbers and all have an honest conversation as Vermonters instead of this media manipulation that I can demonstrate and has been going on for years? Fie to you who say we are racist with no evidence. It's time for you to prove what you say. It's slander. Spread the word. Don't let Vermont and its families and its heritage and its culture and its wonderful traditions be soiled by lies that put us all at risk. Vermont has a great history of treating people of color decently and being tolerant and banning slavery. It's never existed here, and it's never been okay. Oh, we had 3 slaves here. What does that mean? Sowell talks about this, using the exception to argue against everybody. You know, like using George Floyd to then paint all police as wrong. Gee, you wouldn't want to say that all black people are bad because one guy committed a crime, right? Gee, but the other way around seems to be okay. This is the sign of emotionality, not logic. Don't put up with it anymore. Push back. Ask people that call us racists, just like if they called us pedophiles, to prove it, because otherwise they're scoundrels. Stephanie Seguino, please answer for yourself. We really want to know the truth, both of what the real numbers are and why you have been lying to us. Thank you, Vermonters, for listening to what I'm trying to move towards truth. We're sick of being lied about and lied to. Get involved. Don't let them do it anymore. They're coming to get you in the woods. Come out of the woods and look what your government is doing to us. God bless you. Thank you. More soon.